Corporate greed. The term conjures up an image of the monopoly man, sporting a mustache and manipulating the world around him to fill giant cloth sacks with dollar signs on the side. Or maybe a man in a suit crumpling money in his fists for some reason. But in the real world, corporate greed has been a growing problem that has cost our government, and by extension ourselves, billions of dollars. Corporate greed has run unchecked in America, and this has had ramifications on almost every aspect of our lives. There are a few different effects of greed, so let's take them one at a time. Taxes. By avoiding taxes and through deregulation, corporations have avoided paying almost $200 billion in taxes every year. Wages. By keeping the minimum wage lower, corporations are not required to pay their own employees enough to live on, resulting in hourly employees being forced to work 2 or 3 jobs at once and rely on government aid programs to help them feed their families. Lastly, the sheer level of profits for owners and CEOs. While management pays employees as little as possible, their companies are recording record-setting years for profits. With so much of this profit being taxed very minorly, if at all, instead of helping pay for the programs designed to help the hourly wage workforce survive, the profits are kept at the upper levels of society. First, let's investigate taxes. In 1966, Congress repealed the financial transaction tax, a tax that targeted stock transfers at a rate of just 0.004%. This marked the start of a trend towards deregulation of businesses that continues to this day. Though many bills have been proposed in both the House and the Senate to reinstate a financial transaction tax, ranging from a minor tax of as little as 0.025% on stocks to 0.5%, or even a bill proposed by Chaka Fattah of Pennsylvania that would have had a 1% tax on all financial transactions, including stock trading, bonds, and derivatives, but it would entirely abolish the federal income tax. Thus far, no effort to reinstate a federal transaction tax in the U.S. has become law. This despite the polls conducted in 2012 and 2013 that reported over 2/3 of Americans support the idea of a federal transaction tax. This government funding, coupled with the possible funds brought in from offshore untaxed profits of corporations estimated at $32 trillion, bringing in $260 billion in taxes, and with big businesses reducing their tax payments from 22% in 2008 to just 10% today. That's another $255 billion. And finally, the IRS estimate of 17% of taxes being unpaid each year, adding $450 billion to the tally, meaning that the United States has lost $965 billion in taxes last year, and all from giant corporations and the wealthiest percentile of Americans. So the question is, how does this affect us? How does it affect the middle and lower class with our hourly wages and a family at home? Well, with the reintegration of a financial transaction tax, our government would finally be funded enough to lower the federal income tax, or do away with it altogether. The sales tax that forces a parent to give over $1 to the government for a $10 purchase could be lowered, while the companies that refuse to give even 1 cent from a financial transaction would finally be taking up the responsibilities they should have in supporting their government. There are probably some of you thinking, what about my stocks? What about my long-term investments and my pension fund? Don't worry, it would barely affect you. The brunt of the tax would fall upon short-term speculators. And for the half of American households that don't invest at all, there would be absolutely no effect. Now that we've looked at the wealthiest section of Americans, let's look at the counterparts. Those who work hourly jobs and are subject to the federal or state law of minimum wage. And if we compare minimum wage to the cost of living for each state, calculated at what is necessary to make per hour for a full-time job in order to afford a 2-bedroom apartment, it is clear that the gap between the two, even for states that have increased their own minimum wage above the federal standard, the closest cost to wages is a $5 gap in Arkansas. This means that a family as a whole must work more than 2 full-time jobs to support themselves. The rough translation of this is that the cost to fill the gaps made by families who cannot make enough to support themselves falls to the U.S. government. through programs like Medicaid, unemployment insurance, food stamps, and welfare, the cost of the government is in the hundreds of billions each year, and the cost is only rising. Without corporations doing their part to support the cost of government their own greed is causing, the bill falls on the rest of us. There are, of course, arguments against raising the minimum wage, claims that companies would compete with each other, raising their own wages for workers in order to gain the most profitable workforce and thereby have the most profitable company overall. This theory falls short because of a simple fact. The workforce needed for minimum wage jobs is far from specialized, particularly when the average family needs to work 2.6 jobs to support themselves. The argument that companies will raise wages to attract an ever-expanding workforce is nullified. The amount of Americans actively looking for work far exceeds the amount of jobs hiring at the minimum wage. Because of this, companies can remain competitive while still paying their employees minimum wage. The popular number to raise the minimum wage to is $15 an hour. But, according to the CBO, a raise to $10.10 an hour would be enough to raise 900,000 Americans out of poverty, saving the government $7.6 billion each year in support programs. This, coupled with the billions that could be available to the government from that financial transaction tax, could be used to fund additional job programs and much-needed support for the truly destitute who desperately need it. This approach would be a giant leap forward from the trend of deregulation in the financial market and the minimum wage requirements staying far below the current cost of living in America. But what can we do? We're just citizens. We're the workforce. We're not part of the famed 1%. We're not business owners who can choose to raise our own company's wages like Costco or others who support the raising of minimum wages and have done so in their own stores, like the Container Store, Gap, or IKEA. Well, there is something you can do. Learn the issues. Investigate on your own the problems America faces. And after you've made your own decision on the problems at hand in this country, select candidates for national and, more importantly, local elections and vote. Thanks for listening.